we're going to talk about the sequencer. When I have been at the Buchla booth, one of the first questions I typically get is, how do you start this sequencer? Which is fair. I mean, there's no start button, and I'm sure people don't really know. But as I've been saying throughout this series, what clocks the sequencer? It is the pulsar. The first thing we need to do to get this sequencer going, actually there's multiple things, but I'm going to go with this. The first thing we need to do is get the pulsar going. So, as you might remember, to get the pulsar self-operating, which is repeating, we set to self and we press the button. Bam. Now it's going. But wait, the sequencer's not going. Why not? Well, that's because we have the sequencer currently set to off. We're going to need to turn the sequencer on to be controlled by the pulsar. And pow. Now you can see that with each flash of the pulsar, there's a step happening in the sequencer. Awesome. But why aren't we hearing any sound? Fair. Okay, so right now there are voltages coming out of the sequencer, and those voltages are fed to our blue jacks. That's the only place that these voltages that we've set here are going. So what we need to do is connect those jacks to a destination. So I'm going to connect this blue jack to the input of the frequency of the complex oscillator. And just for fun, I might do that same thing with the modulation oscillator. We'll do something very straightforward and basic and boring and have the sequencer just control the frequencies of the easel. Okay, so now you might say, hey Mark, I still don't hear anything. And that's because we need gates to be happening. Now, as it happens, I have a pulse being sent from the pulsar to gate 2. So I can do this. So gate 2 is being controlled by the pulsar, and the pulsar is also controlling the sequencer. So as the sequencer changes, so does the gate. So we have that going. But what about gate 1? We don't have anything coming out of gate 1. Well, that's because we need to tell the envelope generator to be triggered by the sequencer. So we could also have it be triggered by the pulsar. So now they're both going. However, we really want the envelope generator to be controlled by the sequencer because of the pulse sequence. Okay, so now we get to decide to what degree these voltages affect our oscillators. The higher you set this, the greater the range that the sequencer is going to control the oscillator. So the super high settings are going to be the highest settings on the oscillator. The super low settings are going to be low settings on the oscillator. So you get to range the degree to which these settings affect an oscillator. And it's the same for both oscillators. So the complex oscillator is only mildly controlled by the differences in these voltages. And the modulation oscillator right now is set so that the variations between these settings are much greater for it, if that makes sense. Okay, so right now, you might also notice that we're only doing 3 steps. That's because we have a switch right here. We could set it to 4. Or 5. Okay. The next thing I want to show you is that the reason why we wanted the envelope generator set to sequencer is so that the pulse sequence can control it. Make sure when you start out that your pulse sequence switches are all up, because that means on. So then a pulse is being sent from the sequencer to the envelope generator with every step. So there are two signals being output by each step. The voltages that are being set to the blue jacks, and a pulse is being sent to the envelope generator. If you have it set to pulsar, it's not going to get that pulse. The reason we want this is because we can switch all of these off, and now the envelope generator is not triggered by the sequencer, and we can make random choices about which notes will be. Now, of course, if your note is longer, if your envelope setting is longer than the step setting, which is to say the speed at which it moves from step to step, you'll get these hangovers like we're kind of hearing here. But if you make it super short, we'll just hear every time you see an up switch, you're getting the envelope generator triggered. So then you can create your own rhythms. Which allows a fair amount of variation. Okay, wow, that for a random sequence, that's not too bad. Okay, so that is basically how the sequencer works. We need to feed the sequence a pulse from the pulsar to have it advance. So that is cool. We can also voltage control the sequence step with this input, but you have to adjust it internally to make that possible. Anyway, we adjust how many steps the sequencer is going to be with this switch, and we direct what triggers each step with this switch, which has an off, which we've had it on the pulsar. We can also switch it to keyboard, and then every time you touch a key from your 3 different sets of inputs, you're getting 2 things happening here. The note information, the gate from the notes I'm playing is triggering the sequencer, and then the pitch that's being input to the Easel command is controlling the relationship between the voltages of the sequencer, so it gets kind of confusing. So you get to, you can do all kinds of rhythms if you're controlling it this way. If you have a sequencer that has rhythms, you can get really complex, ever-changing rhythms so that these 5 steps don't sound like they're just repeating over and over again. And by changing the frequencies, you can get even more. Anyway, so that is a thing that is possible. It's more fun to use the keyboard to control the sequencer when the sequencer is controlling something other than the pitch, though I will tell you that, and I'll demonstrate it in a while. But let's go back to just having it controlled in this way. Now, maybe you're a person who says, I wish that I could create rhythms because each of these steps really makes you know that it's just 5 notes repeating over and over again. What you need to do then is do this. And this is weird. Are you ready for this? I'm not ready for this because I can't seem to grab a cable. Okay, I'm going to take the output of the sequencer and I'm going to plug it into the input of the pulsar. Now, this is a little bit weird because the pulsar is currently controlling the sequencer. So what happens when I take the voltage output from the sequencer and plug it into the pulsar? Well, initially it's going to freak out, but wait. Now these voltages are causing the pulsar to trigger at a certain rate, which is causing the sequencer to move forward at a certain rate. Stick with me. So if we calm this down a little bit, you'll start to notice that there's a relationship between the advancement and the voltage. So by doing this, you actually can create rhythms in the sequencer, even though it's not, it doesn't do that on its own. So basically, by taking the voltages out of the sequencer, putting them into the pulsar, which is controlling the advancement of the steps of the sequencer, you can create rhythms. Now I'm changing the step count. So it gets really, really complex what you're capable of doing by using different functions in the easel to control other functions that are in turn controlling the original function. That's the kind of weirdness we are dealing with this instrument. So with a little bit of planning, you can find frequencies that you like that generate rhythms that you want to make this outcome. And so it's a lot more complex than just a simple 5-step sequencer like you might have thought. And also, like I was saying, you can do things where you're not actually controlling you're not actually treating it like a sequencer, but actually like a modulation source, which makes it a lot of fun. So you can do things like take the output from the blue and put it into like the timbre. So in that instance, what we're doing is these voltages are controlling the amount of wave folding that's happening. And yeah, so the sequencer isn't just for making notes. You can use it as a modulation source that can do lots of interesting things. And also another thing that I might point out that I should have done when I had it set up that way, when you switch the polarity on the complex oscillator and you have the sequencer's voltages going to both the modulation oscillator and the complex oscillator, by switching the polarity, you're getting the opposite voltages out of the sequencer and you'll get different notes, and you can actually create harmonies with it. I should probably just demonstrate this. I'm sorry, bear with me for a second here. Let's just get this back. This is a thing I should have demonstrated before. Okay, so we'll get this going again. Of course, you're going to have to bring the pitch up on the complex oscillator. So now you can hear we're getting two different sets of frequencies from each of the oscillators. And of course, if you want to do the trick that I was just showing you, you have harmonies. Of course, you do have to program those harmonies and the rhythms all so they all work together. So you have to find settings that create not only the rhythmic structure that you like, but the relationships between notes by adjusting the inputs of the frequencies and the amount that the sequencer is controlling the pulsar, as well as the voltages in the sequencer. So yeah, this is not a simple musical instrument. It looks simpler than it actually is, which is kind of terrifying. But this is basically how the sequencer works. And it is a great tool whether you're using it to create notes or whether you're using it as a modulation source.